Hello and welcome to First Principles. I am stepping in today as your host. I'm Jacqueline Timmer, founder and director of the American Voters Alliance, and my father, Phil Klein, is graciously having me on as host today. Today, our guest is Jen Tafuto. She is a former teacher from Manchester, Connecticut, who has left her job due to the introduction of critical race theory in the classroom. So we're happy to have her with us and to share what exactly is being taught to our children and why it's dangerous. Jen, it's great to have you on today. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me, Jacqueline. I'm excited to be here.
So Jen, you come from a family of educators. What's the first memory you have of thinking about being a teacher?
Well, my mom was a special ed teacher for about 35 years. And I remember one year for Christmas, all I wanted was an overhead projector. Throwback to those. And she convinced her janitor at her school to dig one out of the dumpster. And that was my Christmas present. So it's been a dream of mine for a long time.
Wow. So what did you do with this overhead projector and about how old were you? Because I'm just picturing this right here.
Yeah, it was in my basement in my little setup classroom down there with all of the other discarded materials that she didn't need anymore. And I would have my dolls and my stuffed animals and some of my neighbors, and they were my students. I was probably 7 or so. And it was just, it was all that I wanted to do when I grew up. And so I was really excited to start this career.
What types of things did you teach your students in that 7th grade classroom, and how did you imagine that playing out?
So I was about 7 years old, and I would take whatever I was doing in school and bring it home to my students, air quotes there with my students, and I would reteach them what I was learning in school.
That's awesome. That's been the plan. That's what you did. And you went through the education process with that. I believe you went to UVA and then also Johns Hopkins as well. Tell us a little bit about kind of that experience for you.
Yeah, definitely. I went to the University of Virginia. I studied communication disorders. So I was going into speech pathology, and I decided, it was my 3rd year at UVA, I decided I wanted to apply for Teach for America. I still had that calling to be a teacher. And rather than going back to school to get a different degree that kind of late, I applied for TFA and I got in early. And so I fulfilled my Teach for America Corps commitment. And I stayed in the classroom, and that's what I've been doing ever since. When I started teaching, I got my master's while I was teaching my first 2 years.
In which grades?
I taught 5th grade math and science at a charter school in Bridgeport, Connecticut.
Okay, awesome. And just recently, as our guests know, or our viewers know rather, you recently left your position due to the introduction of CRT in the classroom. What were you teaching prior to that, and when did you see that first being introduced into the education environment?
Absolutely. So like I said, I started my teaching career in Bridgeport. I taught for 3 years, 5th grade math and science there. And I moved up to Northern Connecticut. I've been teaching 2nd grade in Manchester for the past 3 years. And I resigned at the end of the school year. I've started seeing an introduction to some of this work over the past few years. And this past year, it got to a point where I was feeling so uncomfortable during staff meetings and in my own classroom teaching these lessons to my students, because they were seemingly scripted with this one-sided narrative. And I just found it really controversial and uncomfortable. And I felt like I was doing a disservice to my students by teaching them these things.
I want to hone in on that, and especially the fact that you're a 2nd grade teacher and this is being introduced into that age level in classroom. But how did a lesson plan or putting together, a lesson for math or science or history, what was the process for that before? Because you mentioned the scriptedness. So I'm curious the differentiation there.
Yeah, so the district provides the curriculum for the most part. They follow the Common Core state standards. I do want to say, though, you mentioned history. We don't teach history in 2nd grade. So that's kind of one of those really important pieces that people who are supporting critical race theory say that it's teaching history. I teach 7 and 8-year-olds, and we don't have a history curriculum that's given to us. So I think that's kind of one issue that's at play here. So the scriptedness kind of came in with this equity curriculum. So they don't say, hey, you're going to be teaching critical race theory. They call it equity. And they're very big on saying that equity is giving students what they need to be successful. So they provided read aloud books that had characters of all different races and backgrounds. And we were given many questions and prompts to ask our students throughout the read aloud, where we were expected to point out the character differences in race, identifying the characters by the color of their skin, and asking questions such as, I wonder why many white people didn't want Black people to have an education. Another question that I asked that really made me so upset this year was the question that said, I wonder if I've always made my Black students feel welcome in my classroom, something along those lines. And that was really hard for me to take, because this was something that I had always dreamed of doing, and to question my integrity as a teacher, my morals, that was really hard.
So this is the curriculum that they're pushing for these seven-year-olds and 8-year-olds. Your first memory of teaching, of play teaching, is as a 7-year-old. How would that have affected your 7-year-old self? And how do you see this affecting the students in the classroom?
That's a great question. I think that if I had been taught these things from such a young age, I don't know if I would have continued down this path. I think knowing how uncomfortable I have been as a teacher through the staff meetings and the training on this, I can only imagine the discomfort that my students could feel. I think it's unfortunate that they're starting it from such a young age, because it's almost forcing them to be exposed to it and to feel comfortable with it. But the long-term effects, I don't know, but I worry about them. I worry that my students are learning that they're a victim, my students of color. I never want them to feel like they're a victim. And I don't want my students who look like me to feel that they have guilt, that they should have guilt, and that, they're hopeless growing up in this country.
Right. Sorry, it's just very compelling. I'm like crying over here. I'm trying to keep it together.
Tough. It's really tough.
I just can't imagine. In Georgia, just recently, there was some backlash, and I can't remember the specific school, so you'll have to forgive me, but they actually segregated the classrooms of the students by race, by color. I feel like as a nation, we've worked so hard, even though there have been injustices, to overcome that in such a way that we look at people, as Martin Luther King said, by the content of their character. And it seems like this is just completely dismantling that. How are your peers, as far as other teachers, responding to this? And what's the dialogue happening as far as, the school faculty? What's going on there?
Yeah, well, it's tough because people are feeling, fearful of speaking out. I think I definitely had conversations throughout the years where people are uncomfortable with these topics and these conversations. People don't feel like it's right to be exposing our kids to these questions and these topics of conversation. But people are scared of being targeted and being labeled. I was talking to someone the other day, and I remember this year during staff meetings, they were encouraging more white people to speak up. But there's that fear of, if I speak up and I don't say the right thing, am I going to be labeled as racist or as something else? And so it's been very uncomfortable. And I think that a lot of teachers, at this point, they feel that and they don't want to partake in it, but they're kind of in a weird situation of, do we speak out and possibly have a target on our back and be blacklisted, or do we want to speak up and defend the rights of our students and their well-being?
Kind of looking at the compare and contrast again. You have the introduction of critical race theory into the classroom, which is kind of a general term, so I'll want to dive into that in a moment. But as far as the atmosphere for both the students and the faculty when you started teaching versus what it is now, what are the three big glaring differences that you see, if any?
Well, I think that overall there's such a shift in focus from academics and student success in terms of test scores and, how they're progressing. Are they prepared from one grade to the next? And now the focus is on this equity work. And the same kind of goes with staff, right? So curriculum development and professional development, there's such a shift in focus of meetings. So we're devoting much more time to these conversations about equity and pushing these politics and race, and we're not focusing so much on the successes of our students.
I know we've seen something very similar it's happening across the nation, but specifically here in California, where now students are able to graduate. A lot of them can't read and write properly, but they are being put through these equity classes. What does that prepare a student for in life? I mean, we're seeing kind of this push of a welfare state, the shutdown of small business. What's the outlook for society with that kind of an education?
I mean, beats me. I don't know. Unfortunately, I think that this work is just becoming bigger and bigger and more prominent in schools. And I hope that more people speak up about it, because I don't see how these kids will be prepared for the future. We're supposed to be teaching them how to read, how to write, how to engage in problem solving, critical thinking. And that's still happening. Don't get me wrong. I mean, we're not taking away all academics, but there's such a shift in focus. And I think that a lot of it's just taking away from giving the kids potential to succeed outside of the classroom.
A lot of people are obviously promoting this. Many people aren't, I think far less than we would like to. I don't know. The loud minority is often the perceived as the majority, but those pushing this agenda would say that essentially, we owe this to children of color, that we need to teach them the truth of what happened and how they're perceived and prepare them for the hard knocks of life. How do you see this affecting children, and what exactly, can you speak to some of the specifics of critical race theory as it's being introduced in the classroom?
So I think going back to the first thing you said about, teaching this to students of color and having them learn the history, I think that this relates to what I said earlier about the lack of a history block. So I fully support history and teaching it in its truest form and understanding where we were and where we've, what we've progressed through and now where we are. I think it's really important to expose kids to the truth. I don't think it's necessarily going to benefit anyone to not talk about racism at all. That's not what I'm saying. I think it is important to talk about how bad racism is and what we've done to overcome examples of racism in the past. In terms of my students of color, like I said, I worry that they are growing up to think that they're a victim, that they're hopeless, and that the country is out to get them, because that's not the case. And so, yes, as a white person, I do want my students who look like me to feel comfortable in the classroom and to not feel, like they should have any guilt. But equally, if not more, I want my students of color to never feel that they are a victim and that they can succeed with the color of the skin that they've been blessed with.
You recently signed a petition, or a pledge rather, and I want to pull up some of the language of this. In the pledge, it goes through and it affirms various elements of values as well as historical facts as far as the US. But at the very end, it says, therefore, I pledge to help replace elected officials, school board members, education commissioners, principals, deans, and university presidents who promote a false, divisive, and radical view of America and our fellow citizens with new leaders who respect our history, our values, our rights, and the God-given dignity of every person. I think that's such a powerful pledge because it promotes action. You are taking action. What would you say to others right now who are looking at these issues and are uncertain about what to do?
I think that a lot of teachers have experienced the quote, lean into the discomfort. That's been a big one used in these equity trainings and meetings. And I think that that holds true for this too. If you're uncomfortable, then lean into it and talk about it and do something about it. I think that it's doing a disservice to our students. They deserve better. They're the future of our country, and their families deserve better as well. We've worked hard to get where we are, and if we are complacent and silent, then it's going to continue to happen, and it's just going to get worse.
Thank you. One last question for you here. Do you think that we are losing the ability to have dialogue about real issues as we have the introduction of some of these theories into the classroom?
Yes, I definitely do. I think that there's a lot of walking on eggshells with these conversations. I think that people are scared to speak about their experiences and about how they truly feel about topics because of the notion that if you're not accepting and conforming to certain beliefs and the push that school systems in particular are kind of pushing on staff and students, then you're going against the grain and they don't really want to listen to you.
Thanks, Jen. Really appreciate all that you're doing, and it's great having you on today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for joining us today on Phil Klein's First Principles. Again, I am your temporary host, Jacqueline Timmer, and it was such a pleasure speaking with Jen. You know, I really feel like truth is at stake here as we are losing the ability to have dialogue around real issues. The introduction of identity politics is a danger and a threat to our society, as we've seen all throughout human history. And it is here and present today, and it is in our children's classrooms. So this is something to really pay attention to. If you're interested in signing the pledge along with Jen, you can do so at 1776action.org. Again, that's 1776action.org. As my father, Phil, always says, freedom isn't complicated, but it is also not easy. So be sure to take action and take action where you are locally. Thank you again for joining us today. And it is a pleasure